If your excess body weight was simply a result of consuming too many calories, then why has all the attempts that you have made in the past to reduce your caloric intake and or exercise more failed to achieve any sort of lasting weight loss for you? Trust me when I say this, I own clinics that service across the nation. I've been treating patients in the weight loss space for 20 years, and my clinical experience tells me if you don't focus on an approach that incorporates focus on improving hormones, specifically insulin, you are going to be fighting tooth and nail to achieve lasting weight loss. And let's get into it. So the management of obesity and just weight loss as a whole, what a wild ride this has been, and what a crazy string of events. And we're going to get into all of that. But I think the consensus is clear. And I think most of you watching this would agree with me that we don't know what the hell we're doing when it comes to weight loss, maintenance, obesity management, because I think the statistics speak for themselves. We are failing, and we are failing miserably. The approach has been nonstop for the last 50 years, all about calories. But what you'll find so interesting is for about 100 years prior to that, we actually knew it was excessive consumption of carbohydrates. So we had a full century of thinking like that. And then we switched over to the calorie approach. And this is when we had the biggest explosion of obesity. And we're going to get into all of that. So I think it's time for a paradigm shift. I think it's time to rethink the entire approach towards our understanding. And I know a lot of you haven't been living in a cave somewhere. You heard of these powerful GLP-1 medications like semaglutide and tirzepatide, the most potent weight loss management medications I have ever seen. What they tell us so far from their effectiveness, that there's more to this weight loss equation than just calories, because the two primary mechanisms of GLP-1 medications, yes, we know about the reduction of hunger, but they also dramatically improve insulin resensitization. They decrease insulin resistance. And this whole argument right now, the controversy, is it all about calories? Is it all about hormones? GLP-1s don't tell us because they help both sides of the equation, which is why my opinion has always been that calories matter, right? So anybody that says calories don't matter at all, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. Calories matter, but at the end of the day, whether or not you enter into a caloric surplus or a caloric deficit that's needed for weight gain or weight loss is going to ultimately be controlled by your hormones, which is why the approach that we should be putting more attention to is the hormonal basis of obesity, specifically the insulin carbohydrate model. The insulin theory really does answer all of our questions. But before we get into insulin, let's just take a look at the current scene right now. I mean, obesity is a significantly debilitating disease. It's a significantly debilitating issue, and it is your path down all-cause mortality, type 2 diabetes, cancer, heart disease. All of the biggest causes of death and mortality are all perpetuated and driven by obesity. And if you're sitting here watching this going, well, I'm not obese yet, and you just got 20 pounds, 30 pounds, 40 pounds, every single additional pound of body weight, unless we're talking about muscle mass, which unfortunately most of us are not carrying extra muscle mass, every extra pound of body fat is increasing that percentage, that likelihood of us driving towards that obese pathway, of us becoming obese. So it needs to start now if we want to prevent that cascade of significant health problems down the line, but more importantly, just quality of life. I mean, even if you are a quote unquote healthy obese person, which just means you're healthy for the time being, but that will not last. What about the mental effects, of being overweight? And in this society, in this day of age, regardless of whether we want to accept obesity and we want to not body shame, yada, yada, yada. I don't even want to get into that right now. But the bottom line is nobody complains about looking better. Nobody complains. Nobody is not smiling when they look in the mirror and they see less of a gut, maybe some definition in their arms, or maybe even a six-pack or some defined abdominal muscles, right? Let's look at some of the data right now, because this study right here looks at the global trends. Let's compare 1975 to 2014. 1975, about 5% of people were obese. Definition of obesity, about 30 or so on the BMI. And so 5% of the population, so about 200 million people were obese. Look at the jump between 1975 and 2014. 15% of the population are now obese. That's 1.08 billion people. And unfortunately, It doesn't take a rocket science to say that that trend is not moving in the right direction. We have no control whatsoever and have made very little improvements in the trends decade by decade in terms of obesity. And we're going to show you those trends here in a little bit. This study right here shows, and this is kind of scary, but looking into the future, 2030, there's some estimates that 70% of children and adolescents will be in the obese category. Let that sink in for a minute here. Childhood obesity, juvenile obesity is significantly worse than regular adult onset obesity because you have now strained your organs and your body parts to work from a much younger age. And so we can expect mortality to happen at a sooner age, development of progressive diseases to happen at a younger age if the obesity has onset from an earlier point. Not to mention, it is significantly harder for children to be obese in this day of age with the way we look at it. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Trust me when I say this, I hit 300 pounds as a 16-year-old, and I went through years of ridicule and shame, and I got made fun of, I got picked on, and I fucking hated it. I never accepted myself. And I don't wish that upon anybody, even my greatest enemy. It's great that I don't have any enemies, but if I did, I wouldn't even wish this upon them. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of a history lesson. This is going to be an ongoing history lesson through the next few slides, because when we understand what got us here, it does make and paint a cleaner picture for us in regards to the problem that we have at hand and the potential solutions in front of us. We got to give credit, though, where credit is due. Dr. Jason Fung, author of the Diabetes Code, the Obesity Code, the Cancer Code, and the PCOS Code. If it wasn't for his work, I don't think I'd be here today, but I think a lot of people would be suffering significantly, because what Dr. Fung did was tell the most difficult story to be told. And unfortunately, and we're going to get into all the research where this stands, but the hormonal basis of obesity is not a proven basis for obesity. It's still a theory. By the end of this video, I think you'll agree with me that this basis makes a lot of sense and that it is the answer to all the unanswered questions or all the paradoxical situations that we have going on. So he really set the pace. And from there, we notice an explosion of other clinicians, other weight loss programs, other methodologies out there. And I'd have to imagine if you were practicing and you've always noticed, let's just say weight loss, for example, but we can say the same thing about diabetes. You've always noticed this pattern, this approach towards calories didn't make a lot of sense. Some things were not adding up. Patients would swear to you, Dr. Jones, I am only eating 1,600 calories. I swear, and I am exercising, right? This whole put down the fork, get off your butt and exercise. But you got patients staring you in the face. It'd be one thing if it's one patient, you can, let's go, Jane. Come on. Are you really doing this? It's really easy to brush them off. But then it's Jane, then it's Dwayne, then it's Mike, then it's Chris, a significantly large population of your patients all telling you that they are eating less and moving more, and they are not losing weight, right? This is a all too common scenario. Ask any physician who's practiced over the past 50 years, and they will tell you. And it's unfortunate, having lived through that times, I can only imagine, because you had to make sense of what was in front of you. And the only explanation at that point was calories, calories, calories. How can you not shame people and make them feel bad when that's the only logical answer that you have? Crazy time. And I'm glad that we're past that. But I got to just reiterate, it was the work of Dr. Fung, in my opinion, that led the path. And I think over the next 10 years, so much more can be expanded on. And I hope to be part of this controversial topic. And I look forward to the future where we can possibly even use the data from my clinics, where we actually help patients achieve lasting weight loss, focusing on the hormonal basis of obesity. And I also talk about it in the book that I wrote too as well. Okay, so the paradox of obesity. So just look at what we saw in the 1970s. I think this snapshot, look, a snapshot obviously only tells us a limited funnel, but I mean, I think this says a lot. Generally speaking, and we're going to show you some graphics of obesity here in a little bit, but we saw significantly less obese people. We saw significantly less overweight people. There wasn't all this craziness about calories, about diets, about exercising excessively. It just wasn't needed, right? We knew about exercise, we knew about diets. I'm not saying that didn't exist, but it was significantly less talked about because it wasn't needed. And now we've put in a massive increase in our effort, yet the paradoxical situation exists. We are more fat, we are more obese, and it's horribly trending in the wrong direction. It's wild to understand, but prior to the 1950s, for about 100 years, we actually looked at carbohydrates, excessive consumptions of carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, as the culprit behind obesity. So, oh man, times have changed, right? Depending on how old you are, ask your parents, your grandparents, what they did for the battle on obesity. And they'll tell you it was just understood that we eat less carbohydrates. Many doctors at that time spoke of that. Many medical books refer to that and discuss that as the standard. Something changed though, right about in the 1950s. If you look at this graph here, we can see that there was decade by decade a marked increase in the death rate due to heart disease. Okay. So that's a big deal. We need to figure out what the heck is going on. And so researchers went to work attempting to figure this out, attempting to solve the dilemma, right? Why are more people dying from heart disease? So there are many ideas. One very powerful theory is the increase in smoking. If you look at the chart to the right, you see that there was a marked increase in smoking. There was also another component of us dying less from infections, specifically like tuberculosis. We had improvements in vaccinations, improvements in antibiotics, and just overall public health measures. So we're dying less from infections, and we are increasing the rates of smoking, right? Remember the era where smoking was healthy for you? So it is plausible and very logical explanations as to this being the culprit behind the increase in heart disease, but we didn't know that. We didn't look at that. There was some faulty research that came out that looked at saturated fat and cholesterol as the culprit. So a massive debate ensued between the 50s and the 70s where we had proponents of this cholesterol saturated fat versus not. That's not the case, right? And again, looking at this argument, I would imagine a lot of people sitting here that were against this idea of saturated fat and cholesterol being the culprit saying, wait, hold on. We've always ate lots of saturated fat. We've always consumed certain amount of fat, right? We've never made an effort to decrease it as long as we can remember. So how would human beings all of a sudden just evolve this reaction to saturated fat and cholesterol? That's what I would have been thinking for sure had there not been a consensus drawn. But guess what? 1977 marks a point in history, a monumental point, if I say so myself. Big brother government stepped in and made a decision for you regarding your health. This was the first time, by the way, they did this. They said, you know what? And look, I would get behind this if there was some advancement in the literature, if there was some conclusive data, something that they can latch on to. Nope. There was no advancement in literature. There was nothing conclusive or anything even close. They just made a decision and said, saturated fat and cholesterol, we need to avoid this. And when we think about this for a second, what are the three sources of calories? We have fat, carbohydrates, and protein. So if you decrease fat, that only leaves you with carbohydrates and protein, and you can only eat so much protein. So inevitably, as a reaction, you increase your consumption of carbohydrates, which again, for the last 100 years, we knew how bad excessive carbohydrate consumptions were. But that's all you're left with as a result when you make a massive increase and a massive attempt to decrease heart disease. So that is what took place. And mind you, this didn't just take place in America because this was a powerful campaign. We all grew up. This pyramid here looks all too familiar, right? Massive efforts from the government, massive efforts to change our curriculum in schools and have the entire, at that time, USA accept. But as I was mentioning earlier, this actually rolled over into the entire world. And the rest of the world adopted this concept of less saturated fat, less cholesterol. Bottom of this food pyramid, boy, oh boy, let's get in our breads, our grains, our pastas, our rices. That's the staple of a healthy diet, right? At the very, very top, fat, right? Wild, wild, wild. How many of you guys remember the whole fat-free craze? Thank God we've gotten past that point, right? The fat-free. But for a while, right, you could even dissect the last 50 years, because remember, now we're at a point where the GLP-1 medications are out, and we know there's more to this. But for the last 50 years, it was a pretty narrow viewpoint that it's all about calories. And within a good portion of that, we literally said fat-free, high-sugary foods were healthy for you because they were devoid in fat. How did that do for us, by the way? I'd say it didn't do too good. Let me know in the comments. If you guys remember growing up and having this idea that high amounts of carbohydrates, grains, whole grains was the way to go. And it wasn't just a shift in an increase in consumption of carbohydrates, but there also was this promotion of eating more meals. Like, we didn't snack before. Again, depending how old you are, if you ask your parents or grandparents, there was no snacking. You got your 3 squares a day. If you missed your meal, you waited the next meal. Like, finish your meal. That's it, right? So we had a big increase in the amount of time, aka fasting, and we're going to talk about that later, periods of time throughout each day where we weren't eating. Just look at this chart here, 1977 to 2003, right? About 3 squares a day was the average, all the way up to about closer to 5 to 6. So that is a massive increase. And this is a graph representing a snack and or meal, essentially a time where we're eating, which is causing an insulin secretion, insulin being the hormone that's in response to the release of into the ingestion of carbohydrates and many other macronutrients. We're going to talk about insulin in a second. So the summary of the big shift in the last 50 years, which also marked the massive increases in obesity that we saw, were a shift into more carbohydrate consumptions and a shift towards meal frequency, right? There wasn't a massive shift in calories, by the way. I just want you guys to understand that. When you look at the data regarding caloric intakes, there really wasn't a massive increase, yet we saw staggering increases in obesity since then. Okay, so now let's talk about genetics, okay? Because this is the starting point when we start shifting our viewpoint off of calories and we start asking ourselves the questions, why are some people just lean, right? Like, think about it for a second. You have those friends, loved ones, can eat whatever the heck they want. And not, some of them are just stay at a healthy weight. Some of them have a 6-pack or have defined arms as a woman, and they eat whatever they want. And then you have other people, yours truly, you look at a muffin and you gain some fat. This is just the reality. How the heck could calories explain that? We've all seen these things that just did not align at all with the calorie basis of obesity, yet we were told to ignore that. So genetics play a role here. But before we get into some of the studies, let's take a look at this clip from the episode of 60 Minutes that actually aired on January 1st, 2013. Let's have a look-see.
It's a brain disease.
It is?
It's a brain disease. And the brain tells us how much to eat and how much to store.
Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford, an obesity doctor at Mass General Hospital, an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, says common beliefs about obesity are all wrong.
It is your turn to get on that scale.
And diet shows, like The Biggest Loser,
You lost 128 pounds.
are snookering people.
Wasn't that show so exciting, guys?
You lose weight, right?
For many of us, we can go on a diet, something like The Biggest Loser, right? You go and you restrict people, you make them work out for 10 hours a day, and then you feed them 500 calories. For most people, they will acutely lose weight. But 96% of those participants in The Biggest Loser regained their weight because their brain worked well.
Because she is so confused, isn't she?
To store what they needed or what the brain thinks it needs.
So willpower,
Throw that out the window. My last patient that I saw today was a young woman who's
Throw it
39,
out the window, guys.
who
Willpower
struggles
means
with
nothing.
severe obesity. She's been working out 5 to 6 times a week consistently. She's eating very little. Her brain is defending a certain set point.
A set point, says Dr. Stanford, is a range of weight your brain is in charge of maintaining by controlling how much food you eat and how much of it you store. One theory is that it's an evolutionary survival mechanism that helped retain fat during famines. So we had COVID. Lots and lots of people gain weight. Do those people have a new set point that's higher now?
Absolutely. So when you have a chronic stressor and you get to a certain weight and maintain that weight for, let's say, at least 3 to 6 months, then you recalibrate that set point to a different set point.
A lot to unravel with that one, folks. Okay, where do I even begin? So there is a lot of truth, as sarcastically as I seem and appear to be with that reaction. There is a genetic component to this. Really, my only problem with her reaction, truthfully, because there's a lot of accuracy to what she said, was the profound position that this is an incurable brain disease. Like, that's it. If you have this disease, that's it. Willpower, throw it out the door. Oh, man. Maybe I should let her have a conversation with David Goggins, if you guys know who he is. But yeah, that's just not the case. In fact, we have some really good data that we're going to talk about here in a little bit when we talk about people that did use willpower and mindset to beat this brain disease. Whatever you want to call it, truthfully, in my opinion, it's a combination of both genetics and lifestyle choices. Okay, so let's paint a timeline here, because this is pretty wild, right? So for a century before the 1950s, we knew carbs were the problem. Then for about 50 years, all of a sudden, massive change caused by the government. Then it's all about calories. Then it's our fault, by the way. The government didn't take responsibility for the shift and the cause of obesity. No, it was our fault. It was calories the whole time. There was nothing that we did. And now, all of a sudden, in the last 5 to 8 years, with the excitement and explosion of GLP-1 medication use like semaglutide or Zepatide, now all of a sudden it's a 100% incurable brain disease. Will you guys make up your mind? I won't go too far down that rabbit hole. I think that you guys can figure this out on your own in terms of what's really happening here. I'll always say follow the money. But I am a big fan of these GLP-1 medications. I want to make that clear. If you do have obesity, you will need these medications. It's just how you use them, how you incorporate them. That's what we're going to talk about near the end of this video. I have a really good YouTube video called The Obesity Conspiracy. It's essentially where I take a deep dive into obesity and other conditions where people struggle with weight loss, maintenance, resistance, and do you need to take these medications for life? It's called The Obesity Conspiracy. You can check out the video on our YouTube page. Okay. Now, let's get into some of the studies that really build and tell a story regarding the genetic contribution, okay? Because again, this is a disease and there is some genetic components, right? There was some studies done where they specifically looked, they call them the Danish twin studies. Specifically, they looked at, there was 2 main studies. The first study, they looked at adopted kids and they made correlations, right? Trying to figure out, okay, so kids that were raised by other parents, do they correlate obesity with their adoptive parents or their genetic parents they've never lived with, that they've never seen, right? In most cases. And strong correlation existed regardless of who raised them with their genetic parents, and none existed. So that kind of squashes the whole environmental contribution basis, at least to a certain point. And then a second big study that was done, which bigger, I will say, where they actually looked at fraternal and identical twins, same concept. They wanted to compare them to their biological parents versus right, who raised them, and same thing. They found a consistent trend, a consistent correlation with the genetic line and the rates of obesity. So I don't know how they came up with 70%, but they came up with 70% as their opinion with regards to how much obesity is rooted from purely genetic causes. And Dr. Fatima from 60 Minutes says it's 100% incurable brain disease. Whatever it is, me personally, I call it 50-50, because trying to answer that question is really insignificant and doesn't really tell us much, and it's pointless. It's futile. Let's focus on what's in front of us, which is the other non-genetic component, the lifestyle component. What are the other things outside of my genetics that can have an impact on those hormones, which are causing this massive difficulty with dropping weight? Putting it all together, this chart really just summarizes it. So you can see here the trends 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way up. And you see that big spike there pointed with the yellow line. You can literally pinpoint the massive spike in the rates of obesity with this shift in our nutritional approaches. Again, eating more carbohydrates and snacking more often, meal frequency increase. You cannot look at this and say that is random. That is probable. There is no freaking way you're ever going to try to convince that to me. And this also proves that it's not 100% genetics, because if it were 100% genetics, like some of us want us to believe, right? Incurable brain disease requires lifelong medication, then you wouldn't see a massive spike this fast, because evolution, which is the change of our genome, takes a long time to happen. Now, there's this study called epigenetics where lifestyle can influence genetics, but I'll talk about that in other videos. So generally speaking, it takes a significantly longer period of time for your genetics to change. And so we know that outside of genetics, there were huge contributing factors to this massive spike. And we just talked about them being, in my opinion, the massive increase in carbohydrates and increase in meal frequency. Let's look at some powerful literature right here. These two studies looked at successful weight loss maintainers, which, by the way, folks, was a very difficult thing to accomplish. The data shows about only 1 out of 5 people over a couple years, all weight loss measures. This is independent of whether you did semaglutide, tirzepatide, weight loss medications, didn't matter. All weight loss measures only yield about 1 out of 5 people who successfully maintain their weight loss past a couple years. So this is the unicorn, folks. I want you to run a little experiment for yourself. Look at all the people that you know that lost weight over a couple years ago. How many of them still have successfully maintained their weight loss? You'll find that it's pretty consistent with this statistic. So we have this unicorn phenomena. It is extremely difficult for everybody to successfully achieve lasting weight loss. Now, these two studies looked at what are the characteristics? What can we identify that existed among the groups of those successful weight loss maintainers? And you know what they found, which is really interesting? It had very little to do with what they ate, how they ate, when they ate, which you would think is like the main thing, right? No. Most of the characteristics that they found present in this unicorn population were things more in the mindset category: positive attitude, supportive environment, group coaching aspects, cognitive therapies, which can equate to having systems in place for when you fail, getting back on the horse and continuing to try. So this is all mindset. Literally, the strongest data that we have looking at successful weight maintainers tell us that the only thing that we can identify is mindset. You guys remember David Goggins here? Whew, this guy is a beast. Probably the mentally strongest individual on this planet. And there's actually some research on him and a really cool episode with David Goggins or with Andrew Huberman. But he sets the bar for mental toughness. And he and many others have shown us that despite physical limitations, a strong mindset can get you where. And when it can get you to your goal. And with regards to weight loss, that is literally what we see in this research. So we can't conclude anything else from the research regarding what is it, again, it's not what they eat, when they ate, how they ate. It's these mindset characteristics. That's all we can decipher thus far with the research that's been done. Again, remember that the majority and primary focus has always been the caloric approach for the last 50 years. It has not been an emphasis and a focus on methods of lowering chronically elevated insulin levels. And we're going to get all to that. We're going to get into all that here in a little bit. To make matters even more confusing, the biggest studies that we have trying to decipher, right? Is it all about calories? Is it all about hormones? Appear to tell us that's all about calories. So these randomized control studies here, human trials, they set out, and what they did was calories were controlled in the various groups. So there was going to be a caloric deficit for everybody. But in these various groups, some ate ad libitum in terms of the amount of carbohydrates. So higher carbohydrates, lower carbohydrates, more fasting. They compared all these different methods, but keeping calories controlled. And you know what they found? And it was shocking to me when I first saw this study. It didn't matter. When calories were actually controlled for, in the shorter term aspect, people lost the same amount of body fat. So mind blown. You guys probably know this person here, Mr. Lane Norton. Human randomized controlled trials. I love Dr. Norton, and I hope one day to be on a podcast with him because I really want to ask him what he thinks about this. But these studies tell us something very powerful. They tell us when calories are actually controlled, when calories are accounted for, it doesn't matter the method. But do you guys see where I'm going with this? In real life, when would calories ever be controlled for? Right? Is it that easy to simply eat less for the rest of your life? Boy, if we could do that, I think obesity would be a lot better. My personal experience, again, remember I told you guys I lost 100 pounds. I struggled for over a decade being unable to maintain my weight loss. I lost about 100 pounds. It wasn't until I finally figured out how to optimize my hormone levels, specifically lowering my insulin levels, improving inflammation levels. And I did that with a lot of long fasting and many other things too as well. We're going to get into all that later. But it wasn't until I did that that I actually achieved stability in my personal weight. I then became a doctor of chiropractic, focusing on functional health, working with medical practitioners in my clinic. And we helped patients with weight loss, various autoimmune conditions, and incorporated a lot more fasting. And I can tell you emphatically from a clinical perspective, much more improvement in patients' outcomes and health, even beyond simply weight loss when we incorporate longer rounds of fasting, which the primary effect of that is the lowering of the insulin levels. When we focused on lowering those insulin levels, improving the insulin resistance, we got better results. We got more lasting weight loss. So a lot of you watching this that are on the hormonal side are like, no, I get it. This is the actual, but then you have everybody else, especially people and very well-educated people like Dr. Lane Norton, who I respect a ton, who will revert back to the human randomized control studies, which they rightfully should, because that's the point of research. It is for us to draw conclusions. And in the category of what's the best method for fat loss, these RCTs are the strongest research that we have. So it looks like the debate is over. But what if we are misinterpreting the research? There is an analogy that's more prevalent in the research world. You may have heard of it, maybe not. The square peg in round hole analogy. As you can see here in this graphic, it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You do all this research in terms of getting that square peg into the square hole. But then when you go into real life outside of the research, it's not a square peg. What's out there in real life is a round hole. And the study that you're looking at to tell us, right, what we think we need to know doesn't apply because there are other variables in the setting that we think is representative that confound the original study's ability to give us the conclusions that we need, right? Now, that might be a little bit confusing, so let me give you an example here. Imagine a study that was done on adults. It could be any study with regards to how they think, how they process information, attitudes, any of that, right? Study on humans, right? But we do it on adults, and then we go apply that study on children. We all know the results would be very conflicting, and the point of giving us conclusions that we can accurately then draw other conclusions would be out the door because we know how differently children think than adults. So it is my working theory that this is what's happening with these human RCTs. It is my working theory that we are looking at these studies that tell us unequivocally that when calories are controlled for, it doesn't matter how you go about losing weight, right? So in order for those studies to represent what actually happens in real life, right? Because remember, when it comes to human studies that involve caloric intake, a lot of them are done with self-reporting, which, as you can imagine, self-reporting calories is horribly inaccurate and very inconsistent. These were powerful studies, a lot of which done in the metabolic wards, where they could absolutely guarantee calories were controlled. And if you wanted to get a powerful conclusion based off of how many calories somebody was taking in, then you would want to control that. And so a metabolic ward and many other methods were done to ensure calories were actually where they studied and where they thought, so that we can draw accurate conclusions regarding the consumption. And in this case, they were looking at caloric deficits, which all yielded weight loss, appropriate weight loss, because calories were controlled. Boy, oh boy, does human life work that way? Is our ability to eat a reduced amount, or even an increased amount if we're trying to gain weight, because it works that way too, is it just something that we can do? Like, is that in our conscious effort? No, it's silly to even think that this was something that was within our conscious control. Not only is it silly and just logically impractical, I've already shown you guys the research earlier where we looked at people that actually maintained weight loss, and it took mentally tougher people to do that. So we already have research invalidating how we are interpreting these human randomized control studies. We know how difficult it is in the real life setting, in reality, to get into and maintain a caloric deficit. Imagine you would have to have somebody around you 24/7, watching you all the time, slapping food out of your hand if you are past your caloric goal, to ensure that you hit the intake that we set out to hit. I hope he doesn't hit you. He doesn't hit your food out as aggressively as this individual does.
Shit, man. Bro, what you doing, man?
You said today my cheat day, man.
Hey, you don't cheat that, man. Waste your meal.
You said it right
Waste
there.
your meal. Waste your...
Whew. Yeah, that's it's pretty wild. And that clip actually cracks me up every single time. So, but I think we're on to something, right? You guys tell me, in the comments, but misinterpreting this research would explain why we notice so many inconsistencies with regards to the results of calorie-based approaches. I wanted to interrupt for a quick second and tell you guys about the free weight loss plateau busting guide that you can get. I'll link to it in my description, guys. I break down the exact steps of what you need to solve that dreaded weight loss plateau, and more importantly, how to prevent it. Now back to the show. So what actually dictates the attainment of energy balance, meaning what actually affects whether we are in a caloric surplus or are in a caloric deficit? Because the literature earlier told us, and we know now, you absolutely have to be in a caloric deficit to lose weight, and you absolutely have to be in a caloric surplus to gain weight. So we know that's true. But what are the factors that affect whether an individual who doesn't have our friend watching them 24/7, what are the variables affecting them? And the two driving variables are basal metabolic rate and hunger. Well, guess what, folks? You know this again, and this is why this is so silly, but I'm saying it anyways. You don't get to choose when you're hungry. You don't get to choose when you're not hungry. Hunger is completely out of your control, other than changing your diet and lowering insulin levels and lowering inflammation and improving health. We know and have seen some effects on improving hunger levels, getting better sleep, and we'll get into all that later. So, but generally speaking, we don't get to control that. Now, the other big aspect is how many calories you burn at rest. So the amount of calories you burn per day, we call that TEE, total energy expenditure. There's many pieces that make up an individual's TEE, but the BMR is the primary component. That equates for about 60 to 70% of the amount of calories you burn. This is with all the exercise, all the movement, everything else comes from if you were, and the way they measure BMR is no movement at all. That's what your basal metabolic rate. Your BMR is controlled by your body via a change in hormones. So your body can shift your metabolism via signals from hormones like insulin and leptin. But really the primary driver that we need to focus on is insulin and not so much leptin. So again, you don't get to control your metabolism as much as you'd love. You don't get to make a decision to just rev up your metabolism as much as you'd like to be, as much as you might have been led to think with various supplements, but without external factors, you really can't. And an example of a situation where your body significantly decreases your basal metabolic rate is an example where you hit a metabolic plateau. And I have a really good video on metabolic plateaus. If you're stuck there, go check that out. But that's a situation where your body cranks down your metabolism. But it also cranks it down in other situations, which we're going to get into when we talk more in depth regarding insulin. So your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, and your hunger levels are ultimately going to be the thing that controls whether you are able to attain the caloric deficit that we know, thank you for the research, is needed to achieve weight loss. And I'll just add one more thing, right? Conscious effort. We can get out there and consciously restrict our diet, right? We can consciously stuff our faces if we're trying to gain weight, but it's really hard to do that, right? And again, this is where we go back to the data that shows us the unicorns. Those were the unicorns. Possible, but you're basically guaranteed to not fall into that category, statistically speaking. So again, what is the explanation here? What is going on? It quite possibly couldn't be calories when you look at all these pieces. And let's take a deep dive here into how insulin works. And you guys tell me by the end of this video whether you think insulin is the primary factor behind your obesity or not. So here's the research that I think needs to be done. Okay. So we need to look at various methods of caloric deficits, right? If we stepped out of the daily caloric deficit and we looked at a weekly caloric deficit, because it shouldn't matter, right? Based off of numbers. But one arm of the study was doing more fasting, lower carb. The other methods were not. And we were setting the study up to look at adherence rates and success rates. I would argue tooth and nail. I'm extremely confident that we would see better results with adherence to protocols that incorporate optimizing and lowering insulin levels and making changes that improve health, like reduction of inflammation levels too as well. We still have to be in that caloric deficit, but improving insulin and improving our health makes it easier via mechanisms of hormones like insulin to get into those deficits that are needed for weight loss. Let me know in the comments if you know of any studies that are being done. I haven't seen any studies anywhere close to this. I found some very old, poorly designed, small studies, but nothing that we can draw any conclusions from. Let me know if you know any literature that's actually looking at these sort of things. When we look at the insulin theory, the hormonal basis, it really does answer all the questions. It really does solve all the problems that were created about calories, that were created from the caloric approach. Look, this is just, again, my personal experience with myself over 10 years of struggling and then working with thousands of patients. I managed gyms and managed thousands of clients and then became a clinician myself. And so I have a 20-year track record of seeing this to be true. Take that for what it is. But this is just what I've seen to be true, is it's significantly easier when we focus on improving health and, more importantly, lowering insulin levels. If calories work for you, do that. Like, again, if you fall into that 20%, if you are the unicorn, because we're going to have some unicorns by definition here, then great. But for the rest of us that are not unicorns, unfortunately, then I think understanding what we're about to get into next is really going to set you up for success to then structure and have motivation and confidence behind ulterior methods. Like, for example, what we do with our patients via the flow protocol. So I have this really awesome 2-minute clip. It's got really cool visuals. Let's watch this so that we can understand some basics regarding insulin.
Insulin is a hormone that is produced by the pancreas to help regulate blood levels of glucose, amino acids, and fats after a meal. It does this by having a strong effect on 3 main organs. Number 1, muscles. Number 2, fat tissue. And number 3, the liver. Let's take a closer look to see how this works. So after eating a meal, let's say a slice of pizza, the pizza will enter the small intestine where it's broken down into 3 components: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. All of these will be digested and absorbed across the intestine into the blood in three main forms: the carbohydrate as glucose, the fats as fatty acids, and the proteins as amino acids. Let's focus on glucose. So within the blood, before the meal, blood glucose levels is in a range of 4 to 5.5 millimoles per litre. But as the glucose floods into the blood, this level will start to rise. Unfortunately, the cells in the muscles, fats, and liver, their glucose doors are now closed. So the glucose can't enter these cells. Bring in the pancreas. The pancreas, in response to a rise in blood sugar level, will release something known as insulin. Insulin then has a strong effect on these three organs, starting with the muscles. Insulin will bind to the muscle cells, which opens those glucose doors. Glucose will enter the muscles and are made into energy, known as ATP, to power the muscles. But insulin also helps the glucose to be stored in the muscle as a carbohydrate known as glycogen.
It's important to note that bodybuilders, some of them actually resort to injecting insulin. So as much as we think of insulin as the enemy, it's extremely important for muscle mass, and muscle mass is continuing to become more and more important. So insulin is extremely important when it's used the right way, and we'll get into all that later.
Glycogen. Additionally, insulin can also help to suck up the amino acids into the muscles, which can be made into proteins. Across in the liver, insulin helps the glucose, like we saw in the muscles, to be stored as glycogen. But in addition, insulin helps the liver to make the glucose into fatty acids. Finally, in fat tissue, insulin will allow glucose to enter the fat cells, which then is converted into glycerol. And then lastly, insulin helps to absorb fatty acids, which came from the pizza, and also the liver, to be combined with glycerol and stored as triglycerides. So insulin, as you can see, helps to decrease the glucose, the fatty acids, and amino acids in the blood after a meal. If a person was unable to make insulin in the pancreas, or these cells become desensitized to it, it would lead to a condition known as diabetes.
Great clip. I hope you guys found that is informative. I'm not good at drawing, and so you'll never see me with a whiteboard in front of me drawing. But I do think visuals, and I do really like the way he explained things. So to summarize, when we look at insulin, everybody's so caught up with looking at insulin as the whole blood sugar driver, right? Diabetes, blood sugar. I get it, because diabetes is such a rampant issue, but we forget that just as important of the function as regulating blood sugar, insulin also is our primary storage hormone. It is responsible for all macronutrients, carbohydrates, protein, and fat, getting into our body. Because remember, in our blood is technically not in our body. I know it gets like, wait a minute, I thought that's in my body. In your cells is in your body. Think of your room and your house, right? Really, if we can call your room the part of your body where all the magic happens and all the various processes, that we got to get it from the house, because that's when you consume it. It gets into the house, and then insulin's responsible for getting it into the room, getting it to where it can be used into the cells. That's the primary function of insulin. So insulin is, when we talk about fat loss and fat gain, primarily signaling the storage of excessive calories into fatty tissues. So again, we have fat, we have protein, we have carbohydrates. Now, protein, when it's not utilized for where it needs to be for building muscle tissues, repairing tissue, because our body has a certain amount of amino acids that it's going through literally every minute. After all of that, any excess protein will just be converted into energy, into glucose, a process known as gluconeogenesis. And then of course we have carbohydrates. So carbs and excessive protein, before it's deposited as fat, actually will get stored into our stored reserves of carbohydrates. We call that glycogen stores. So carbohydrates, specifically glucose, which is a form of carb, glucose will be converted via many different processes into glycogen, where it is then stored primarily in your liver and in your muscle tissue. The reality, though, is about an average person has somewhere between 1,600 to 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrate stores. That's it. So you have about a little bit less than a day's worth of energy that you could technically all get from your stored carbohydrates. That's not that much. So this is where human beings have evolved powerful mechanisms to allow us to last longer periods of time without eating, via the benefit of our fat storage. Fat is essentially almost an endless supply of energy. And it goes down a completely different set of physiological processes, none of which we need to get into for this video. Insulin is secreted when we raise blood sugar. Blood sugar raises pretty much every time you eat. It raises a little bit with fat, almost nothing, more with protein, significantly with carbohydrates, right? So when you have insulin elevated, your body is in storage mode, right? But we have to understand that in a healthy body, it is very transient. So let's look at transient insulin release versus chronically elevated. So a healthy individual can eat a ton of junk food, a ton of crap, 4 times, 5 times a day. And if we were looking at their blood levels of insulin over a 24-hour period, you would still see a relatively small percentage of that 24-hour period where insulin was actually elevated. Very different than somebody eating the same amount of carbohydrates and the same amount of junk food who is insulin resistant, who has other metabolic issues that raise insulin levels, because insulin resistance isn't the only one. Now they have chronically elevated insulin levels all the time. Very different scenario. This is part of that perplexing situation, that paradox. Why the heck can my friend eat whatever the hell they want and not gain weight? And how come I look at a muffin and I blow up? Well, we talked about the genetics and the contribution from genetics, but where genetics are actually manifesting in terms of mechanisms within the body are specifically what we're talking about now, right? How quickly does an individual develop insulin resistance or other conditions that will cause chronically elevated insulin levels? So again, the energy balance, as we talked about earlier, is absolutely vital. We know that from the data, right? And this is where the confusion comes into play, because it doesn't matter if I'm in a caloric deficit. But being in a caloric deficit when your insulin levels are lower is very different than being in a caloric deficit when your insulin levels are higher. Yes, in a caloric deficit, so the obvious happens when you are in a caloric deficit and your insulin levels are lower. Guess what? That whole turn your body into a fat burning machine truthfully requires both, not just insulin, right? So by the way, if you ever see anybody talking about calories don't matter at all, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And I call those parrots that are just parroting off information. And they don't really understand that, because again, we have those human RCTs. Calories do matter. But with regards to what we are talking about right now, calories matter, right? But what dictates and controls where we are going with calories? So what does it look like when you are in a caloric deficit that we know will produce some weight loss, but you have elevated insulin levels and lower insulin levels? Well, we know what happens with lower insulin levels. This is the fat burning machine. And it's so crazy when you think about everybody right now that says, and if you see anybody on social media or TikTok talking about calories don't matter, and they actually mean that literally, they don't know what they're talking about. You need to run, because we already know based off the data, calories do matter to the point where you have to be in a surplus or deficit in order for lasting weight loss. So fat burning machine is when your body is in a caloric deficit and insulin levels are lower, because you don't have this signal which is trying to store the food that you're consuming as body fat. Okay. So now when you're in a deficit, your body goes, great, I can tap into my body fat stores and utilize that for energy. And I can do that most of the time, right? Because insulin levels are not elevated. I can't do it when insulin's elevated, but I can do it the rest of the day. But when you have now chronically elevated insulin levels, now your body runs into a problem, right? The problem that it runs into is we have opposing signals. The deficit is a stimulus that forces your body. There is no compensation for that. There is down the road, but your body has to get that energy on the short term from somewhere. We see a lot of muscle loss, and we see some fat loss too as well in people who restrict calories and don't handle their insulin levels. So muscle mass and other tissues can be broken down too as well. But also we see the body then over time trigger this metabolic plateau reaction where it says, okay, since you're not eating enough and I'm in storage mode because of the hormone insulin, we're going to have to slow the metabolism down and or make you more hungry, right? This is the horrible and evil effects of your body, but this is what happens and this is what takes place. And so we have to understand that, yes, on the short term, both of those examples will lose the same amount of weight, but we're not talking about initial weight loss. You're not watching this, hopefully, for just short-term weight loss. You are thinking long-term, how can I achieve lasting weight loss? And achieving lasting weight loss involves understanding this and then, of course, applying it. So why do we have elevated insulin levels to begin with? Oh, man, I would say there's many contributors to elevated insulin levels, but one strong theory right now that I've seen to be true, because I focus on that and that's how we help lower insulin levels, is a condition called insulin resistance. And I have a great video that you guys can check out for a deeper dive on not just what it is, but how to actually reverse your insulin resistance with no products or no supplements, just following those protocols. Insulin resistance is a condition where your body is not responding to insulin as effectively as it was before. And remember, we defined insulin as the primary driver of the calories of the nutrition, the macronutrients into your cells. So if insulin is less effective at doing its job, your body's only course of action is to produce more insulin. And your body does that because if it didn't do that, your blood sugar would rise. And we know that condition to be diabetes, the result of rising blood sugar. Your body is fighting tooth and nail to do everything it possibly and humanely, literally humanely, human-wise, the body's doing everything that it can to prevent the blood sugar from rising. And that is the release of more and more insulin. So insulin resistance, which is a decrease in the response to insulin's effectiveness, causes more insulin release. But we just said it was more insulin that created the insulin resistance to begin with. You guys see where I'm going with this and what a slippery slope this is? This is why we see diabetes as such a progressive disease. People think of obesity and diabetes as a progressive, irreversible disease, but I'm here to tell you that's not true. But if we don't understand those mechanisms and do something to stop that cycle, then it does progress that way. And it is incurable and unfixable and unbeatable. So insulin resistance is a self-perpetuating process that contributes to more and more insulin, more and more chronically elevated insulin, which you now have a better understanding of how that impacts your body's ability to achieve weight loss and more importantly, lasting weight loss. So I really like this graphic here. If we look at the top, we talked about this, right? Eating food causes the release of insulin. The release of insulin over time, and now we have a better understanding because we took a lesson through history, right? For the last 50 years, we've been told that the right things to eat and the frequency is what led to chronic insulin release. So that leads to the development of insulin resistance, right? Now that we're insulin resistant, our body has to release more insulin. So if I was to put one more picture between the cells resist insulin and sugar stores as fat, I would put another little picture there indicating increased release of insulin despite consumption of food, because that's the hallmark, that is the most important takeaway from insulin resistance, the situation where you're releasing insulin devoid of what you're eating. So now we have chronically elevated insulin levels, and now we are store. Well, when you are store, now we're down to the feeding time and being more hungry. What are those two things that we talked about that are out of our control, which primarily drive whether you're gaining weight or losing weight? The basal metabolic rate and the hunger cues, which is why we see people with insulin resistant have higher levels of hunger. And we know that, and the data's there. You guys see how, is this making sense? Are you following this pattern? Because it's unfortunate that we just don't have enough people out there putting this all together. Let's continue to have this discussion regarding insulin and its effect on fat stores. I can literally make you fat. Injecting insulin to your body, you will gain body fat much faster, despite what sort of caloric balance that you may be in. So this has already been proven, and we're going to go over a ton of examples here as to where we can see that to be true in real life. This study right here literally looked at the amount of obesity, right? The percentage of obesity created from both lower insulin therapies and higher insulin therapies. That's the difference between the black and the white It didn't matter whether it was massive amounts of insulin or lower amounts of insulin, there was still an increase in the rates of obesity. Just the higher levels of insulin meant higher increases in the rate of obesity. So we know that to be true. There's direct mechanisms of weight gain with insulin. But let's look at the opposing side. Remember that before insulin was available as a medicine, type 1 diabetics unfortunately look like this. So what is type 1 diabetes? Type 1 diabetes is a medical condition where your body is no longer producing insulin. So your body does not have the hormone that is needed to store energy into the cells. And what we saw was a very early death and very much high levels of emaciation and significantly lower levels of body weight. We can see that very clearly. Type 2 diabetes, just to give you a frame of reference, is a condition of high levels of insulin because the body then develops resistance to insulin. So type 1 and type 2 are very different conditions. They end up with, if uncontrolled, higher levels of blood sugar, which is why we see the presentation not too different. But how they got there is completely different paths. But what we're trying to do right now is look at evidence that we do have that continues to confirm what insulin does. Because remember, the only reason right now we haven't accepted the hormonal basis of obesity is because we don't have that data. And I gave you guys my theory and the type of data I would like to see. We don't have that yet. So again, referencing Dr. Jason Fung, his book, you guys can see here in this graphic, the massive amount of research he put in his book, Obesity Code and Diabetes Code. Because we don't have those high level RCTs, he then made up for that with hundreds of various mechanistic and studies, high level studies that we do have to put it together to tell a very convincing story. So it doesn't just stop there. But when we look at medications, for example, what we see in almost all medications that either increase insulin levels or improve insulin sensitivity, we see weight gain. Now, side note, GLP-1 medications are probably one of the only examples, and we have to look at that and consider the fact that, yes, they improve insulin sensitivity and insulin secretion, but they, as you know, dramatically decrease intake. And we already have the RCTs that tell us that is the end all be all, is the caloric deficit. So there's the answer to GLP-1 medications. But outside of that, we see emphatically if the medication has an effect on improving insulin levels or improving insulin sensitivity, we see weight gain. This is very prevalent in diabetic medications and very prevalent in other non-diabetic medications too as well. And this study here looks at medications as a whole and the ones that promote more fat storage. And what a problem that is a great study too as well. Just looking at the problem of weight gain as a byproduct of medications approach towards our health. And I mean, hopefully by now you know that medication for me is a potential solution, but it's definitely something that we very, very respectfully consider. And we are very quick and fast to utilize lifestyle interventions as the ideal choice to heal and address health issues. You guys remember keto, Atkins diet? Whew. A lot of craze over Atkins when that came out, which was the low carb craze. And then now it's keto. And keto's kind of came in waves, very similar to Atkins, right? What did we notice when we stopped eating carbohydrates? Holy crap, we lost a lot of weight. But we knew that for the 100 years prior to the 1950s. It's just so crazy for us to relearn things that we forgot, unfortunately, when the powers that be told us to stop that. But anyways, so a lot of us, any of you watching this can probably confirm that if you tried that, most of you noticed it was just easier to lose weight, that you didn't have to depend on calories so much, right? Again, really proving this insulin basis for obesity. Unfortunately, for a lot of us, though, we couldn't sustain. I'll tell you right now, I could never sustain a keto diet for the rest of my life. I mean, it's hard. I've done a couple months, and it's just, we could make an argument whether I think it actually makes sense. I mean, there really isn't periods where we can look at history and say we were pure keto anyways. Outside of medical conditions like cancer or nerve issues, which I think keto can be a great piece of your therapy and your treatment options, I don't think keto for life even makes sense with what's best for you. But if we're talking about maximal weight loss, it's certainly not sustainable. Oh my gosh, anybody that's done keto, let me know in the comments. But what happened when you went to grandma's house for Christmas and she had some delicious cookies, right? I mean, holy crap. If you guys know Dr. Peter Attia, he literally says, and I love his work and his podcast, he went keto for 3 years, never faltered. And then all of a sudden he was at a wedding. I don't remember whose wedding it was. I think it was a relative of his wife. And he gave in, had a piece of cake, and he ended up having about 10 pieces of cake. So I've personally experienced this too as well. High amounts of restriction cause this inevitable sort of I've missed out feeling, and it leads to potential binging, and it's just a slippery slope. So I don't recommend keto, and I think most of you who have done that and are still overweight know that it didn't work, but that's okay. I bring that up because it does finish painting the picture for us as to why, at least it's an additional reason to consider why insulin is the real culprit here. I love this weight set point theory, and you guys heard it earlier when Dr. Fatima talked about that. I really do look at the weight set point theory as something that does take place and is driven by insulin. So I have another way to explain it, though, that might make a little bit more sense. So think of a thermostat in your house, the master regulator of temperature in the house. If you were hot and you are in one of the rooms, you can bring in a small AC unit and you could lower the temperature in that room, right? But what's going to happen over time? That thermostat's going to detect the decrease in temperature and it's going to crank on more heat. And eventually you'll hit a point where your temperature goes back up to 80 degrees with the portable AC unit running. This is the all too familiar experience where I decrease my caloric intake or I increase my exercise, and eventually my weight loss stalls because your body slows down the metabolism and increases hunger, doing everything it can to crank your weight, to get your weight to get back to what it was at. And you can fight tooth and nail to stay at your decreased weight, but eventually most people give in and their hunger controls them and they end up eating more. And now it doesn't take as much food to be at a surplus to gain weight because their metabolism slowed down. That's the super frustrating part where you're like, I'm eating the same amount that I used to eat and I'm gaining weight because of the metabolic downregulation. That's another piece of the fact that something is driving the metabolism. Something is affecting it here. And that's the effects of insulin. So the insulin theory really does answer a lot of those myths that we have now understood to be debunked. Calories in versus calories out are not interdependent, right? So again, we've subscribed to this idea that it's all about calories in versus calories out, right? And it's that simple basic relationship. But we now know, and insulin explains this, that these variables are not independent. They are dependent upon each other. Meaning, and we gave you plenty of examples earlier, when you increase your intake, you can actually, we didn't talk about this one, but if you increase your intake of food, you actually have an increased response from the body where it increases your metabolic rate. That actually happens too as well, and we've seen that in the data. But the more common experience is the slowdown of the metabolism, right, in reaction to decrease in your intake over time, right? So calories in, calories out, they are not independent. They are very dependent, and hormones dramatically affect this. BMR is not stable. We've already proven that, and we've seen examples now of when your basal metabolic rate can change by the effects of insulin. Calories in is under our control. Holy crap. I wish it was that simple. I wish we can just say, I want to eat 1,800 calories and I can execute on that. No problem at all. But we've already know from the data, unicorns are a rare phenomena. And so we can throw that out the door. Fat storage is unregulated. This calories in versus calories out depends upon the idea that there's no regulation on fat storage. But we know that's not true, right? And we've talked about some examples of that. But think about the body, for example. All the various physiological processes in which your body can allocate calorie usage, right? An excessive consumption of calories can go to fat storage, but it can go to additional production of heat. It can go to more brain power, brain utilization, organ function. There can be increases in something called NEAT, which is sort of your body's twitching and calorie expenditure. And we see that that changes too as well in reaction to surpluses or deficits. So there are many things of which your body can allocate those calories to despite outside of fat loss, which means that fat storage is a regulated process by insulin. Calories are not created equally. Oh my gosh, right? So I can eat whatever I want and I will simply lose weight. And what drives me crazy, have you guys seen this? But there are people posting stupid studies where they'll eat a bunch of crap and they'll do that to demonstrate that they improved health markers. It's one single case study. Let's mind you that. But so it doesn't really tell us anything as far as the representation of the population. But I think that makes sense. We know if you drop body fat, you will likely get more healthy. We will see improvements in your markers. Despite eating all that junk food, you achieve some amount of weight loss, some of which will be fat, and you will see some improvement. But we've already now understand that the short-term weight loss means diddly squat. And yes, I just did say diddly squat. But what matters is lasting weight loss, and we now have a better understanding and grasp over how much insulin affects that. Calorie intake hasn't increased much. This is fascinating. We're gaining all this weight, yet when we look at the data, we haven't seen a massive increase. We've seen an increase in caloric consumption, but nothing close to what would account for the massive amount of weight that we are carrying nowadays compared to what we were carrying back in the days. So the biggest study that was ever done looking at caloric approaches towards weight loss, the Women's Health Initiative trials. They did a lot of studies. They did a bunch of studies on hormones too as well. But as we can see in this study, they followed the traditional path, lowered fat intake, lowered caloric intake as a result from the decreased fat intake, increased expenditure. A lot of weight loss was produced initially, but unfortunately, there was very little lasting weight loss. The majority of participants in the study regained their weight. Again, confirming what I've been trying to tell you this whole video, that if we don't get our insulin in check, you need to be a unicorn to be successful with weight loss. I want to touch on a few more hormones, a few more pieces of your health, and then we'll get into the solution. So cortisol. Cortisol is the second hormone that has a direct effect on being able to make someone fat or make them less fat. So cortisol is our stress hormone, and it is released in stressful situations, causes a massive pump of glucose into the bloodstream, which is, again, stressful situations like seeing a tiger. You need to be able to run from that tiger. You need glucose available. Unfortunately, what's happening to a lot of people is stressful lifestyle situations are producing this stress response, which is causing a chronic elevated blood glucose, which ultimately produces chronically elevated insulin levels. So even though cortisol is a completely different hormone with a completely different source, right? A completely different problem as to why cortisol rises, right? Independent of how you're eating or when you're not eating, right? It's a stress response. But if that's elevated, same thing. And we have medical conditions that back that up. Cushing's syndrome is a medical condition with high amounts of cortisol, and we see weight gain. Addison's disease is a condition of low cortisol, and we see traditionally weight loss. So again, even the effects of cortisol can be brought back to help us confirm insulin. All right, so let's migrate onto a couple other pieces of your health that don't necessarily, and it gets very nuanced, but don't necessarily have a direct effect. Cortisol, as you saw, had a direct effect on insulin. Let's talk about inflammation. So I'll make separate videos for you guys regarding inflammation. I have a ton of videos on Flow University, which is the platform, online courses that I offer for my coaching. It's actually one of my lower tiers of coaching, which is an online platform and group coaching. It's really cool. You guys should check it out if you're looking for some support, but you're on a budget. So I have a lot of videos there on Flow University, but I'll make some longer formats for you guys here on YouTube. Inflammation in terms of weight loss and weight loss maintenance resistance essentially does some of the same things that insulin does, but in completely different mechanisms. And that's all we really need to understand right now. We know that chronic inflammation is part and parcel with poor health, right? Lowering your chronically elevated insulin levels is a marker of improved health. When we see higher levels of inflammation, we see weight gain. For example, autoimmune diseases are the most common example and representation of this. Autoimmune conditions are conditions where we have erratic immune systems and excessive productions of inflammation, and we see higher amounts, propensities to gain weight. Inflammation with its own mechanisms will put us more into a fat storage mode and put us out of a fat mobilization mode. So we have to look at inflammation as a secondary thing to consider when we're constructing a program that's going to give us the best result for lasting weight loss. Thyroid is something that we've been told is like the master hormone. It's really not the master hormone, but it's definitely up there on the list as one of the most important hormones. You have receptors for thyroid on every single cell in your body, and you have trillions of cells in your body. Thyroid hormone is the actual signal that causes metabolism to take place. So metabolism, the actual breakdown and utilization of the substrates of the broken down parts, ATP being the smallest part that we get from the food that we consume, which goes into the mitochondria and it goes into the electron transport chain, yada, yada, yada. That takes place in all of your cells. And the speed at which that takes place, the efficiency at which your mitochondria is running, is driven by the amount of stimulation that it gets from thyroid hormone. And more thyroid hormone means more stimulation. So if you have low levels of thyroid, a condition that we call hypothyroid, you are also not going to lose weight. And this is a very prevalent problem. As we can see here on the screen here, symptoms of low thyroid are very similar to the symptoms that you will see in brain fog, but even more progressed because it's usually it's having been going on for a long time. So lower levels of energy, brain fog, hair loss, intolerance to cold, achy body, constipation. You could even lose that outer third of your eyebrow. So difficulty with losing weight. These are conditions of thyroid. It's just important to understand, and why I'm putting this near the end of today's video is because we talked about earlier how much insulin can impact your metabolism. Well, when we say impacting your metabolism, now you understand that means cranking down thyroid production, which then has that effect on decreasing the energy utilization, aka slowing down your metabolism. So this is why we in our programs are incorporating cortisol reduction methods. And if we need to prescribe thyroid short term to get our patients back to an optimal level to trigger that weight loss, we do in many cases. And in many cases, they get off the thyroid hormone later because we fix those underlying issues. So how do we fix obesity? And I got a better description for obesity. Let's call it weight loss maintenance resistance. I might have said this a couple times so far, but we're about an hour, 45 minutes deep into this. If you watched part 1 and part 2. So weight loss maintenance resistance at the end of the day is the summation of problem, right? The biggest problem that obesity, and it's not just obesity, folks, autoimmune cases, PCOS, menopause, or just various medical conditions, inflammatory conditions where we see weight loss maintenance resistance, even if you're not in the obese category, because the technical definition of obesity is BMI of 30, but plenty of people are hanging out in that 25 BMI range or even less and still have all the hallmark issues that a person with full-blown obesity or morbidly obesity has. So weight loss maintenance resistance. How do we fix that? How can we become a unicorn without having to become David Goggins? Let's get into that. So what we do with our patients is the flow protocol, FLOA, fasting like our ancestors. The flow protocol is the world's most aggressive, prolonged fasting regimen. What I found from my own experimentation, and then, like I said, working with patients, is that we have a pretty good understanding now of intermittent fasting, but I can tell you right now, intermittent fasting is just not enough, especially the more sick your body gets, right? Sick as defined with regard to more insulin resistance, higher levels of inflammation, poor metabolic flexibility. So the flow protocol centers around getting our patients into weekly long fasting rounds. And I have this awesome video on YouTube if you want to check it out, where I take a deep dive into prolonged fasting and everything that does. So definitely check that out if you're curious about why I'm so emphatic about long fasting and the flow protocol approach. Because remember, you could just take semaglutide tirzepatide and lose your weight. But again, we know the stats now behind the difficulty with lasting weight loss. We need to do more. We need to heal the body, lower those insulin levels for lasting weight loss to happen. And this is where we have to be more aggressive with our lifestyle choices. And this is exactly what we do with the Flow protocol. So at the center is regular weekly rounds of prolonged fasting, which I want to make clear to you, we make that very easy because we use medications. Usually the most popular one is tirzepatide, powerful GLP-1 medication. We use other powerful fat mobilizing peptides, depending on what's available, because the FDA, you know how that thing is all going. And by the way, guys, if you're curious about peptide therapy, check out this video that I did, Peptides 101. You guys are not going to want to miss it if you want to learn more about peptides. But powerful fat mobilizing peptides are an integral piece because the GLP-1s suppress appetite, but the fat mobilizing peptides allow your body to tap into the fat and not experience that stress response and difficulty that it would otherwise, even with just tirzepatide, right? Because we got to handle the hunger, but we also have to handle the part of your body can't get the energy it needs to do the long fast. And so it manifests as energy related issues like brain fog and crankiness being the most common one, and tiredness. So the combination of both, I mean, again, working with thousands of patients, we're talking about people slipping into 48-hour fasting within a couple of weeks. Having got patients there without medications and peptides and with just medications, I've seen with just medications, the average time about a month. With medications and peptides, a couple weeks. So significantly enhances the results, and it smooths things out too as well. A woman does have certain times in their cycle where fasting can be problematic. And so what I have noticed, and by the way, Mindy Pels is phenomenal. I love her to death, the advocate for women fasting. And I'd love to have a conversation with her regarding this because she doesn't utilize these peptides. But what I have seen is utilizing fat mobilizing agents decreases the stress response. And so I don't notice nearly the level of difficulty in our women that she does. And I think it's because of what these fat mobilizing peptides can do. So again, the tenets of the Flow protocol and what's needed to fix that weight loss maintenance resistance. We have the weekly long fasting. Now, equally as important, so I call these 1 and 2, but they're interchangeable. Equally as important is reducing your consumption of processed foods. Pillar number 3 is resistance training because of the effect of muscle mass and how important it is to build muscle mass and prevent muscle mass loss. An optimal supplement regimen so that we provide our body with the nutrients it needs, especially when you start long fasting, you have an increased chance of developing a micronutrient deficiency. So we want to prevent that and get on a good supplement regimen. And then finally, optimizing sleep and optimizing stress. We talked about cortisol and how problematic that can be. Lack of quality sleep will increase cortisol, and stress in your life will increase cortisol. So the Flow protocol centers around these tenets, and we provide weekly coaching. We provide one-on-one coaching. I have multiple levels and tiers of support. So definitely, if you guys want to check that out, I'll link to that in the bio or in the description to this video. But you can get yourself scheduled for a free consultation if you are fed up once and for all. If you've known this to be true, that something doesn't make sense. You've tried reducing your calories over and over and over, and it just hasn't worked. If this video answers your questions and it makes sense and you are ready to take action, click that link, lastingweightlossnow.com in the description, and get yourself scheduled for a consultation. If you guys enjoyed this video series regarding the hormonal basis of obesity, you're definitely going to want to check out GLP-1 Realities. I'll link to it right here. You can directly click that. But this is where I interviewed with the most commonly asked questions regarding not just our approach, but just elaboration on some of the things that you've learned today. As always, guys, stay healthy, and we'll see you later.